Hello and welcome to Storytime. Here at Storytime, we'll be exploring the wonderful world of stories. I will share with you fairy tales, fables, and myths. To begin with, I'll give you a simple explanation of the three genres. First, fairy tales are oral stories written down that usually have a magical or supernatural occurrence in them. Think witches, fairies, charms, spells, ogres, and ogresses. Secondly, fables are stories that have very specific lessons or morals connected with them. Thirdly, myths are stories that have gods and goddesses and humans and other mythical creatures. Think unicorns, nymphs, satyrs, and centaurs. Quite often, myths are often explanations of natural occurrences. Think the change of seasons, day and night, for example. Today I'll be reading from a book titled The Classic Fairy Tales by Iona and Peter Opie. This is a scholarly text that claims to have the earliest written versions of well-known fairy tales. It is all cited and footnoted appropriately within the book. Today's selection is Cinderella or the Little Glass Slipper. Relax and enjoy. There was once upon a time a gentleman who married for his second wife the grandest and most haughty woman that ever was known. She had been a widow and had by her former husband 2 daughters of her own humor, who were exactly like her in all things. He had also by a former wife a young daughter, but of an unparalleled goodness and sweetness of temper, which he took from her mother, who was the best creature in the world. No sooner were the ceremonies of the wedding over, but the mother-in-law began to display her ill humor. She could not hear the good qualities of this pretty girl, and the less because they made her own daughter so much more hated and despised. She employed her in the meanest work of the house. She cleaned the dishes and stands, and rubbed Madame's chamber, and those of the young Madame, her daughters. She lay on the top of the house in the garret, upon a wretched straw bed, while her sisters lay in the fine rooms, with floors all inlaid upon beds of the newest fashions, and where they had looking-glasses so large that they might see themselves at their full length from head to foot. The poor girl bore all patiently, and dared not tell her father, who would have rattled her off, for his wife governed him entirely. When she had done her work, she used to go into the chimney corner and sit down upon the cinders, which made her commonly be called in the house Cinderbreech by the youngest, who was not so rude and uncivil as the eldest called her Cinderella. However, Cinderella, notwithstanding her poor clothes, was 100 times handsomer than her sisters, though they were the most magnificent apparel. Now it happened that the king's son gave a ball, and invited all persons of quality to it. Our young ladies were also invited, for they made a very great figure. They were very well pleased thereat, and were very busy in choosing out such gowns, petticoats, and head clothes as might become them best. There was a new trouble to Cinderella, for it was she that ironed her sisters' linen and plaited their ruffles. They talked all day long of nothing but how they would be dressed. For my part, said the oldest, I'll wear my red velvet suit with French trimming, and I, said the youngest, will have my common petticoat, but then, to make amends for that, I'll put on my gold-flowered manteau and my diamond stomacher, which is not the most indifferent in the world. They sent for the best tirewoman they could get, and dressed their heads, and adjust their double pinners, and they had sheet red brushes and patches from Mrs. D. Lepus. Cinderella advised them the best in the world, and offered herself to dress their heads, which they were very willing she should do. As she was doing this, they said to her, Cinderella, would you not be glad to go to the ball? Ah, said she, you only butter me. It is not from such that I am to go hither. You are in the right of it, said they. It would make the people laugh to see a Cinderbreech at a hall. Anyone but Cinderella would have dressed their heads awry, but she was very good and dressed them perfectly well. They were almost 2 days without eating, so much were they transported with joy they broke above a dozen of laces in trying to be laced up close, that they might have a fine slender shape, and they were continually at their looking-glass. At last the happy day came. They went to court, and Cinderella followed them with her eyes as long as she could, and when she had lost sight of them, she fell a-crying. Her godmother, who saw her all in tears, asked her what was the matter. I wish I could. I wish I could. She could not speak the rest, her tears interrupting her. Her godmother was a fairy, said to her. Thou wishest I could go to the ball, is it not so? Yes, said Cinderella with a great sob. Well, said her godmother, be but a good girl, and I'll contrive that thou shalt go. Then she took her into her chamber and said to her, Go into the garden and bring me a pumpkin. Cinderella went immediately to gather the finest she could get, and brought in her godmother. And not being able to imagine how this pumpkin could make her go into the ball, her godmother scooped out all the inside of it, having left nothing but the rind. She struck it with her wand, and the pumpkin immediately turned into a fine coach, gilded over with gold. After that, she went to look into her mousetrap, where she found 6 mice all alive. She ordered Cinderella lift up the little trap door, and she gave every mouse that went out a stroke with her wand. And the mouse was that moment turned into a fine horse, which altogether made a very fine set of 6 horses of a beautiful mouse-colored dapple gray. As she was at a loss for a couchman, I'll go and set, said Cinderella. If there has been a rat in the rat trap, we'll make a coachman of him. You were in the right, said her godmother. Go and see. Cinderella brought the trap to her, and in there were 3 huge rats. The fairy made choice of one of the 3, which had the largest beard, and having touched him with her wand, he had turned into a fat, jolly coachman that had the finest whiskers as ever were seen. After that, she said to her, Go into the garden, you will find 6 lizards behind the watering pot. Bring them to me. She had no sooner done so, but her godmother turned them into 6 footmen, who skipped up immediately behind the coach with their liveries all bedabbed with gold and silver, and clung so close behind one another as if they had done nothing else all their lives. The fairy then said to Cinderella, Well, you see, here is an equip fit to go to the ball with. Are you not pleased with it? Oh, yes, said she, but I must go thither as I am, with these ugly, nasty clothes. Her godmother only touched her with her wand, and at the same instant her clothes were turned into cloth of gold and silver, all beset with jewels. After this she gave her a pair of glass slippers, the finest in all the world. Being thus dressed out, she got into her coach, but her godmother, above all things, commanded her not to stay beyond 12 o'clock at night, telling her at the same time that if she stayed at the ball 1 moment longer, her coach would be a pumpkin again, her horses mice, her footmen lizards, her clothes resumed their old form. She promised her godmother she would not fail of leaving the ball before midnight, and she departed not a little joyful at her good fortune. The king's son, who was informed that a great princess who they did not know was come, ran out to receive her. He gave her his hand, and as she alighted out of the coach and led her into the hall where the company was, there was a great silence. They left off dancing, and the violins ceased to play. So attentive was everybody to contemplate the extraordinary beauties of this unknown person, there was heard nothing but a confused noise of, "Ha! How handsome she is! Ha! How handsome she is!" The king himself, as old as he was, could not help looking at her and telling the queen in a low voice that it was a long time since he had seen so beautiful and lovely a creature. All the ladies were busied in considering her clothes and her headdress. They might have some made the next day after some pattern, supposing they might get some such fine materials and able to make hands to make them. The king's son shooed her on to the most honorable place, and afterwards took her out to dance with him. She danced with him so much gracefulness that the more and more they admired her. A fine collation was served up, of which the young prince ate nothing, so much was he taken up in looking upon her. She went and set herself down by her sisters, and shewed them 1,000 civilities. She gave them some of the oranges and lemons that the prince had presented her with, which very much surprised them, for they did not know her. While the company was thus employed, Cinderella heard the clock go 11 3/4, upon which she immediately made a curtsy to the company and went away as fast as she could. As soon as she came home, she went to find out her grandmother, and after having thanked her, she told her she could not but heartily wish to go the next day to the ball, because the king's son had desired her. As she was busy in telling her godmother everything that had passed at the ball, 2 sisters knocked at the door. Cinderella went and opened it. "You have stayed a long while," said she, gaping, rubbing her eyes, and stretching herself as she had been awaked out of her sleep. She had ever on manner of inclination to sleep since they went from home. "If If thou had been at the ball, said one of her sisters, thou would have not been tired with it. There came to the most beautiful princess, the most beautiful that ever was seen. She screwed up in 1,000 civilities and gave us oranges and lemonades. Cinderella seemed indifferent. She asked them the name of the princess, but they told her they did not know it, and the king's son was very uneasy on her account, and would give all the world to know where she was. At this, Cinderella smiled and said, "She must have been very handsome indeed. Lord, how happy have you been, could not I see her? Ah, good Madam Charlotte, lend me your yellow suit of clothes that you wear every day." "Undoubtedly," said Madam Charlotte. "Then my clothes are such a cinder breach as you are. Who is a fool then?" Cinderella was very glad of the refusal, for she would have been silly put to it if her sisters had lent her their clothes. The next day the two sisters were at the ball, and so was Cinderella, but dressed more richly than she was at first. The king's son was always by her, and saying abundance of tender things to her. The young lady was no ways tired, and forgot what her godmother had recommended to her, so that she heard the clock begin to strike 12 when she thought it was only 11. She then rose up and fled, as nimble as deer. The prince followed her, but could not catch her hold of her. She dropped one of her glass slippers, which the prince took up very carefully. Cinderella came home quite out of breath. Without coach or footman, and in her old ugly clothes, she had nothing left her of all her finery but one of the little slippers. Fell so that she dropped. The guards in the palace gate were asked if they had not seen a princess go out, who said they had seen nobody go out but a young woman very badly dressed, and who had more of the air of a poor country wench than a lady. When the two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had been well diverted, and if the fine lady had been there. They told her yes, but she flew away as soon as it struck 12 o'clock, and with so much haste that she dropped one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest in the world, which the king's son has taken up, and that he did nothing but look at her in all the time of the ball, and that certainly he was very much to love for the beautiful person who owned the little slipper. What they said was very true, for a few days after, the king's son caused it to be proclaimed by sound of trumpet that he would marry her whose foot fit the slipper. They began to try it upon the princesses, then the duchesses, and all the court, but in vain. It was brought to the two sisters, who did all they possibly could to thrust their foot into the slipper, but they could not effect it. Cinderella saw this and knew the slipper, said to them, laughing, "Let me see if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to bunt her. The gentleman who was sent to try the slipper looked earnestly at Cinderella, and finding her very handsome, said it was just that she could try, and that he had ordered to let everybody do so. He made Cinderella sit down, and putting the slipper to her foot, he found it went on very easily, and fitted her as if it had been made of wax. The astonishment her two sisters were in was very great, but much greater when Cinderella pulled out of her pocket the other slipper and put it upon her foot. Upon this, her godmother came in, who, having touched with her wand Cinderella's clothes, made them more rich and magnificent than ever they were before. And now her two sisters found her to be that fine, beautiful lady they had seen at the ball. They threw themselves at her feet to beg pardon for all the ill treatment they had made her undergo. Cinderella took them up and told them, as she embraced them, that she forgave them with all her heart, and desired them always to love her. She was conducted to the young prince, dressed as she was. He thought her more beautiful than ever, and a few days after married her. Cinderella, who was as good as a handsome, gave her two sisters lodging in the palace, and married them the same day to two great lords of the court. The end.